brutish and short. Was he right? Do we really need a much more complex society and technology to ensure that food is plentiful and we live a long life and we are happy? If you look back at history, somewhere between 95 and 99% of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. For 95 to 99%, we were hunter-gatherers. Now, almost all are in urban, industrialized, and we're agriculturally dependent people. However, we still have many, many groups of hunter-gatherers. They're rarely seen, they're isolated, but they're present. As a matter of fact, there are probably well over 75 groups or more around the world. Hunter-gatherers. When I was 6 or 7 years of age, my family lived in a house near fields and a stream, and I used to go out and collect things. Even when I was like 6 or 7, I saw in the springtime fish coming up this little stream, and I caught some with my hands. They were suckers, and they would slide, if I came near, they would slide under a bank, and I could reach down slowly and grab one. I took them home, and a couple times my mother cooked them up. I was so proud. But I also collected, at that same time, I collected frogs and snakes, and I would bring them to the house.
Did your mother cook those up?
We didn't cook the frogs. My mother, she was terrible. She wouldn't cook the snakes and the frogs.
They had frog legs.
Yeah, exactly. Boy, I remember one time seeing the snake with his head down a hole. It was a big black snake, and I pulled him out and put him in a tank that in our house, at any rate. And at that time, my mom and I and other family members would go out and collect wild strawberries and sometimes blueberries and other things. We've all, many of us, continue to be in part hunter-gatherers. But we're missing something. We're missing something that the hunter-gatherers really had. And our life is really far removed from theirs. Why? It's because small group closeness and cohesiveness and sharing and equality are all in the hunter-gatherer tradition. Can we make our life better? Modern civilizations have so many wars. There's so much difference between the haves and the have-nots. There are so many taxes and so many problems. But we do have good medicines, yes. We have much better health care, of course. And we have warm, secure homes for a lot of us. But let us look at the past and say, and ask, was it really worse? What can we learn? Archaeologists have studied ancient peoples. There are hundreds of books and studies, there really are. But currently, there are, as I said, well over 75 and probably closer to 100 primitive cultures that exist. The Hadza, that's the ones that I just briefly talked about, of Tanzania in Africa. The Bushmen of Africa is another group. They're still extant, and they're hunter-gatherers. The Atita of the Philippines, the Marchu of Australia. In South America and in Africa, there are a lot of these groups still present. But more than 95% of human history has been non-urban. We began as a species about 200,000 years ago, and it wasn't until about 4,000 years ago that agriculture was practiced, somewhat extensively. For hunter-gatherers, there were no local laws. There was no evidence of writing. There was no social stratification. There was no conspicuous consumption. Women were generally as influential as men and as powerful. Often, but not always, there was sexual parity. Karl Marx, the communist, who wrote extensively, said this was primitive communism. People lived in small bands of between 20 and 50 people ordinarily, including children. The bands gravitated toward wet and fertile land, like between rivers, where there was an abundance of fruit and nuts and tubers and berries and fish and game. People moved from one area to another to avoid floods and take advantage of seasons. Hunter-gatherers ordinarily do not have permanent leaders. Instead, the person taking the initiative for a hunt for game, perhaps, or fishing, or cooking. The person who takes the initiative at any one time depends on the task being performed. With some exceptions, there was no surplus of goods, though. You only had what you could carry. Jealousy was largely absent. You know, they didn't have a great deal. They carried what they needed. So there were no wars. Besides, friends and relatives lived in neighboring bands and maintained peaceful relationships. Generally, wars did not occur until large towns were developed. There was violence at times, but generally not wars. The characteristics of the hunter-gatherers may seem strange to us today. The communality, all were family and cared for in the band. Children were not children of Mary and Joseph or whoever. Why did I say Mary and Joseph? We're not children of particular people. They were cared for by the band. All the food was shared. It wasn't like we collect in our own little pot. No, it was all shared. That was typical at any rate. This was especially true of meat. There was intense cooperation. They all ate, slept, foraged, and danced together. Equality. There was a practice that many archaeologists would call reverse dominance. Fierce egalitarianism. What does that mean? It means there was little tolerance for boasting. Ridicule was used to deflate people's ego. At least this was frequent as far as we could tell, and this happens in current tribes that are off in the bush. If a man or a woman attempted dominance and would not submit to sharing and the communal good, he or she would frequently be ostracized. You know, there was the word, there was the nod, there was the... And eventually, if it continued, they'd be asked to leave and join another band, perhaps. There's much evidence currently today and from the past that the most aggressive people were punished and made to conform. There's a lot of debate about how much time it took to forage for food. But apparently, many of the experts say that it was ordinarily about 4 to 6 hours a day. And sometimes, you know, they'd collect enough food in one day to last for a couple days. And sometimes an animal would be killed. In one of the Hazda groups that are extant, this guy who was with them for over a period of 16 years, much of the time, you know, there was a couple baboons up a tree. They used some poisoned arrows. They shot both of them relatively easily, and they came down and they had baboons.
I've heard baboons pretty nasty.
One of the negatives, certainly, longevity among current groups, and probably in the past, was about 34 years. About 70% of the deaths were due to diseases. About 20%, these are estimates, were from violence or accidents. About 10% due to degenerative, familial kind of problems. So, and spirituality. Animism was present in just about all of the hunter-gatherer groups. It's easy to understand animism. Children today, from 3 to 7-year-olds, often believe that teddy bears and cars and trees and animals have feelings and thoughts. There are many themes in movies and books on TV about inanimate objects having feelings and thoughts. Animism is common among indigenous peoples throughout the world. It's the belief that spirits are everywhere. It has to do with reverence for the earth and sky, mountains and rivers and trees and even grasses. Humans have a kinship and a mystical relationship with a spirit being in an animal or a plant. That entity is a totem. It's thought to interact with an individual or a group. We're talking about veneration of sacred objects that are treated with respect. Up until 50 years ago, there were still sacred groves and lakes and mountains that have been recorded as being very venerated. In animism, all things have a soul and perhaps feelings and intentness. Notice something, by the way. The animistic view of the world is not hierarchical. It's not there are things that are much higher than others. It's interesting how we attribute characteristics of our own relationship styles to how we think about gods and how the gods wish to be treated. Punishing and hurtful gods, or gods who insist on people being subservient, grew when towns and cities were formed. Then a tribal leader or a king and queen could hire warriors and secure privileges. The common people were made to do bidding. The rules demanded that the common man must obey the rulers, and religion insisted that God was like man and required obedience too, or the person would be punished. If you read anthropologists, there's a lot of evidence over generations and different continents that people's view of gods reflect their own view of their relationships with other people. We make God, man creates gods in his own image, in other words, not the other way around. But what if society is egalitarian? What are the attributes of spirits and gods? There is massive evidence from the archaeologists. The gods are more beneficent, they're giving, they're cooperative. When people are beneficent and caring and cooperative. Civilization. Agriculture developed at multiple times in multiple areas. Multiple times. There was a gradual transition from the hunter-gatherers to the agricultural economies. You know, they first gathered in the wild, and then maybe they pulled some weeds and cut some trees in order to foster better growth of some plants. And slowly they began planting then later. Urbanization crawled out of the valleys and rivers of the Middle East and crept across Europe. It started on the shores of the China Sea and spread inward, generally following the rivers. Same occurred in America. Hunter-gatherers slowly, over centuries, turned into agriculturalists. And eventually into industrial societies. Villages and towns slowly came into being. Tribal leaders evolved. Generally, they were strong and fierce, and they would find other strong men to be by their side. And they produced some positives, of course. Later cities grew. They harvested from outlying lands. Finally, kings and queens came to rule. And always, with the growth of large towns and cities, there were taxes or slavery. And later there were nations, and we had parliaments and presidents. And much has been gained. Our human population has grown slowly, you know. We were less than 1 million in 10,000 BC. By 5,500, we were about 5 million. And still, agriculture was primarily Sumerian in the Middle East and in Egypt, and a few places in China. Writing and taxes followed, and enough density of population allowed leaders to train warriors or acquire them, and they could raise more taxes, and wars began, and territorial expansions. An example around 5000 BC was a town called Ur, U-R. It was 50 acres. It had a population of about 6,000. They had 10,000 animals, of which about 3,000 were slaughtered each year. They had a labor force, people who were required to go out and cultivate. And they cultivated about 3,000 acres. They had oxen that plowed the land. They had wheeled wagons. This was an example, and it was duplicated many times over. As towns and cities grew, stratification and inequality grew. Slavery occurred in many areas, especially after a neighboring part of land was conquered. And, quote, progress occurs. A ruler builds roads. He produces irrigation systems. Intensive agriculture ensues. And in some ways it's good. But it triples the workload. And for thousands of years it creates malnutrition for the common man and woman. Many infants die because of malnutrition for the mother and because of diseases. People became specialized as pot makers and metal workers and farmers. But to some extent, what's happening is it's a zero-sum game that continues to the present. One person's gain is another person's loss. And cultural norms make all of this seem natural somehow and okay. Yes, we do have more to eat. But the difference between the haves and the have-nots has been greatly expanded, actually.
Supply and demand.
Yes, today, 75 years is the average age of death in most well-run, civilized countries. Science, inventions, and progress produce comfortable houses, a rich food diet, an education for most people, cars and airplanes, and complex communication systems. At least for the middle upper classes and upper classes in, quote, civilized, unquote, parts of the world. But much research shows that being one of the lower classes produces problems. We're uncomfortable with those differences. Stress occurs. Cortisol is much higher in poorer people as compared with those who are at the top. Cortisol is a stressor, and it results in people at the lower end dying earlier, having more heart disease, having problems. We rejoice in our medicines and so forth. But somewhere underlying is this uncomfortableness because we've created these huge differences. More stress, less happiness, and a shorter lifespan for a lot of people. At least shorter lifespan as compared with those higher up in the hierarchy. You know, in some ways, it seems foolish. In some ways, I'm talking about the Buddha road. The Buddha road is, you can be happy. You don't need all of the material assets that you have. You really need a good shelter and today's food to stay comfortable. And you need family and friends. But for us, we go to a school that's far a ways from our home. We go to college that's far away. We find jobs that are removed from our parents. We stay at home and watch TV or play with our iPads. We spend only a few hours a week with small groups. And often the small groups are not really tight friends that really care about us like a family might. There's a difference between Eastern and Western cultures. I think Eastern cultures are more similar to the hunter-gatherers in one sense. There's more of a sense of community. In Japan and in China, there's more reverence for older people. Older people live with, and the young all live together. They don't move around quite as much. And there is more of a sense of communality. But it still is far from those ancient groups that are still extant today of 20 to 50 people, where everyone is family, where they don't sort out in terms of, this is mom and pop and child and they eat over here. No, everyone is cared for. That's almost, incomprehensible. But it occurs. And part of our human brain is wired in such a way that human closeness, that we evolved so that we could have that human closeness. That was the way our species evolved and existed for 95% of our time on Earth in those small groups. And we're moving away from that. We have a lot more stresses and stress-related illness. Yes, we have science and a longer lifespan, and we've amassed material goods. We communicate widely with the internet and the TV, but those differences between the have and the have-nots are present, and we have wars, and we have vast pockets of poverty. Have we lost in our progress the communality, the equality, and perhaps the happiness and sense of belonging and caring that came and comes with the hunter-gatherer cultures? Marshall Salins described them as the original affluent societies. They could work instead of, like us, the 40-hour week, and then you go home and you spend another 30 hours doing a lot of stuff. They were spending 4 to 6 hours in collecting food. And maybe a couple of other hours that was communal and more fun, preparing it.
4 to 6 hours a day, not 4 to 6
Yeah,
hours.
4 to 6 hours a day. Yeah.
Not a week. Yeah.
Perhaps we can't choose now, though. We seem to be locked into a system that we cannot seriously imagine changing. Maybe we're in denial. Maybe we're ignorant. Maybe we're unaware of our options. It would take a lot of awareness and thought and effort to change. In some ways, I don't know that we can do much about our current circumstances. On the other hand, maybe we can make some limited choices. Maybe we can think about shutting off the TV and our iPads, not iPods, iPads, and work toward more community, more closeness, more equity, more sharing. Maybe we should meet here 3 times a week. Maybe we should have more group hubs. Maybe we should, I don't know what. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for listening to me.